Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. We've got a topic that certainly is would be of interest to sitting directors today, and that topic is what's next for outside director compensation. And joining me is one of our partners, Michael Brittan, who's a partner with Meridian Compensation Partners. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, TK. It's great to be here.
So it's always a great topic, even though directors say that they really aren't that interested in the pay side of it. That's not the way it actually works. So they are interested. So first of all, why don't you give us a little history? We've seen director pay evolve over the last 3 or 4 decades and sort of have some change. Talk about those changes and why it's changed.
Sure, TK, absolutely. I think, in order to talk about where we're headed in the future, we really need to kind of look in the rearview mirror to see where we've been and why. In the early days of outside director compensation, director pay was really focused on cash retainers and meeting fees, little use of stock, but these are the days of director pensions and retirement plans and perquisites. Then fast forward a little bit to the 90s, we start to see some of those benefits sort of going by the wayside, and we see more prominent use of a combination of cash and stock. Of course, in the 1990s, this is also the rise of stock options in U.S. The corporate economy, and executives and outside directors are starting to see options pretty regularly. So it really wasn't until the late 90s and early 2000s, TK, that we started to see a real sea change in the evolution of director pay. A lot of the changes that we've seen over the last two decades in director pay have been related to the evolution of corporate governance practices. Many of those, of course, coming from corporate scandal, Enron and the like in the early 2000s. But then a number of laws and regulations and rules that had come out of that, including Sarbanes-Oxley and how that implicated and changed the role of the audit committee, as well as Dodd-Frank, and then later on changes in the NYSE and NASDAQ listing standards. What that really led to, TK, was a real heavy emphasis now on cash and stock compensation, less use of meeting fees, really practically no more director pensions and retirement. You see now restricted stock or full value shares take the place of stock options, with directors setting pay for equity compensation based on a targeted dollar value versus a share denominated number. You also see shorter vesting schedules, and that aligns with companies adopting more annual director election practices. And you see the rise of new board leader roles, independent board leadership roles like non-executive board chair and lead independent director, who typically receive premium compensation, as well as the use of stock ownership guidelines. So really, I would say all of the changes really that you can see in the evolution of director pay over the past 20 years, I think you could really tie back to changes in corporate governance practices.
So that sort of brings us up to today, and if you look today, last couple of years, we're starting to see great interest, particularly from the ISS. I think they sort of started this, but then now it's sort of blended on to other institutional investors as well. And, it surprised me, that we've gone into director pay. I think in the grand scheme of things, it's a nit. But the problem was that there were some outliers that sort of created that attention. And even though 98% of people handle this prudently, now we're seeing some cases actually brought to the Delaware courts around director compensation.
Yeah, TK, you're exactly right. I think companies and boards have somewhat gotten used to the scrutiny that has been on executive pay, and now the next phase of this is the scrutiny and the focus on outside director pay. And I think you really already touched on really the two key areas of focus and kind of where this is coming from. First, it's the Delaware court rulings with respect to some director pay lawsuits. And there have been over the past several years a number of lawsuits with respect to director pay, really targeting excessive director compensation levels, but also some focus on the process and the structure, really how boards go about setting their own pay. Some of the early court rulings with respect to these lawsuits had suggested that as if companies were to adopt quote unquote meaningful limits on director compensation, that would be a good counteraction and defense against some of these lawsuits. And in fact, we have seen in recent studies that the majority of large companies do have some kind of limit on outside director compensation. And it typically ranges between $500,000 to $1 million per director per year. Some of the more recent court cases, though, TK, have suggested that these meaningful limits may not be enough and that companies might have to go further to provide adequate defenses against some of these lawsuits. But the second area really that we touched on, proxy advisors. So ISS, Institutional Shareholder Services, and Glass Lewis both have had policies with respect to outside director pay. More recently, ISS has adopted a policy that will take effect next year where it's seeking to target companies that have excessive director compensation without a sufficient rationale. So specifically what they're going to do is look to capture outside director pay at the individual level, compare that to other outside directors in companies of similar industry sectors, and then look to target really the top 2 to 3% of those individuals. And so the implication, of course, TK, is that where a company is identified as providing excessive director compensation consistently, being 2 or more years without a sufficient rationale, ISS will start to offer a withhold vote recommendation on the committee members that are overseeing director pay.
So you mentioned about the cap. Is there anything else that companies are doing sort of to make sure that they're in line with all these guidelines that are being established for them?
Yeah, I really think that this is the primary impetus, this increased scrutiny for this next phase of director comp evolution, and I'd say it really is a call to action for boards. And I think we'll probably see about 4 or 5 key trends in the future as a result of this scrutiny. The first of which is really just having boards really define and establish a well-structured compensation philosophy and structure with respect to director pay. And so what I mean by that, TK, is establishing the peer group, the percentile and pay targeting, the frequency of reviews, the role of the outside consultant, the structure, the weighting and the vehicles, and then making sure that companies disclose that adequately and thoroughly in their proxy statement. I think with respect to frequency, which I just mentioned, I do think that we're going to start to see boards look at their director pay practices more frequently. I think it's important that they get it right, that they get comfort with establishing that the director pay outcomes are both competitive and reasonable. And so many companies, as you know, TK, really have a practice of looking at director pay every 2 or 3 years. And I think that we'll start to see an annual review of director pay, not necessarily changes every year, but looking and monitoring where we are in the market to make sure, again, that we have it right. One thing that we could see, despite a more frequent review practice, would be a moderation of director pay levels going forward, at least for the near term, and in particular if we are about to enter a period of economic downturn. I do think we could see some flattening out of director pay levels. Already we're at a point where director pay is increasing in low single digits, maybe 1 to 3%, per year as it is, but that could be flattening out. And we are, again, already seeing a very much of a narrowing of the range of director pay. Really the fourth thing I think we'll see, TK, will be just, ensuring that the director pay program, again, aligns with shareholder interest and best practices, and just making sure that the process, again, is well structured, well established, and again, it gets back to transparency in the proxy statement, making sure that we are adequately describing, our approach and that it results in a appropriate and meaningful, reasonable level of compensation. The last thing, and this gets back to the scrutiny in particular with respect to these lawsuits, what I do think we could start to see more of, which are rare practices now, number one, director pay programs that are much more prescriptive and that are approved on a regular basis by shareholders. And this could be taking the form of formalizing the director pay program and putting it into, let's say, the stock incentive plan, and having shareholders approve the stock incentive plan that includes the director pay plan as well. The other thing that we could see would be a say on director pay. Of course, we have say on executive pay right now is mandated by Dodd-Frank. That's an advisory vote, thumbs up, thumbs down on the executive pay. This could be another opportunity for companies to give shareholders the opportunity to reaffirm the company's director pay practices and approach, and provide perhaps a little bit more cover to some of these lawsuits. I think either way, what we're going to see is, TK, is that I really do think that we are at the beginning of a new era in the evolution of director pay, one that is defined by intense scrutiny. And
well, I'm actually sorry to hear that. I mean, there's so many things that directors should be spending their time on. And again, I think this, in the end, other than several outliers, this is somewhat of a nit.
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of things. I'd much rather have them spend time on transformation or digital transformation or cyber or strategy. I mean, but, I understand how these things happen. I just hope that you're wrong in the sense that it gets to the say on pay level for boards too, whatever. So I'll just keep my fingers crossed that
you and me both, TK.
It doesn't get to that level. But I wanted to thank you for taking the time. It's an important topic. Obviously, we're seeing a lot more scrutiny, but I really appreciate that you come in and educate us.
So thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me, TK.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take on another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.